The dust was a living thing on the plains, a pale ghost that haunted the air and coated the back of Alara's throat. It settled in the folds of her worn dress, a constant, gritty reminder of how little she had left. The sun was a merciless eye in the vast, bleached sky, and the wind, her only companion for days, whispered of failure. Her feet, wrapped in rags inside broken boots, were a cartography of pain. Every step toward the distant, solitary shape of a homestead was an act of rebellion against the despair that threatened to pull her down into the parched earth for good. The last town had been like all the others, a collection of hard eyes and closed doors. A lone woman was a problem, a temptation, or a burden. No one had work for her. No one had kindness. The homestead, when she finally reached it, was as stark and unforgiving as the man who stood on its porch. He was carved from the same timber as the rough-hewn cabin, all sharp angles and weathered planes. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, his posture not immediately threatening, but watchful. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with the afternoon heat. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the solitude that clung to him like the dust on her own clothes. This was her last chance. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. She cleared her throat, the sound a pathetic rasp. "I'm looking for work, sir." Her voice was thin, a threadbare thing she barely recognized. "I can cook, I can mend, I can clean. I'll do anything. For a meal. For a place to sleep out of the wind." The man's gaze swept over her, clinical and detached. He took in the fine tremor in her hands, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the desperate courage in her eyes that fought against the humiliation of her plea. He was not a cruel man. She saw that in the way he stood, in the absence of a sneer. He was a practical one. The world had sanded him down to the essential grain. "I don't hire hands I can't pay," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and shameful. She fought them down. Crying was a luxury she had forfeited weeks ago. "I don't need pay, just a place. Shelter." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if weighing cosmic scales. She could feel her hope, a fragile seedling, beginning to wither under that prolonged scrutiny. She was about to turn away, to accept the finality of her ruin, when he spoke again, his eyes finally meeting hers. The words he said were so unexpected, so utterly devoid of sentiment, they struck her with the force of a physical blow. "I have a proposition," he stated, his tone as flat as the land around them. "I need help, more than a hired hand. This ranch, it needs a woman's presence to be seen as whole, to keep scavengers at bay. You need a name, a roof, protection." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the oppressive air. "I have no coin to offer you, and I'll not have folks whispering that I'm keeping a woman here unmarried. So this is the offer. You'll have my name. You'll have this roof and half of whatever this dirt can be convinced to give up. In return, you work. As my partner. As my wife." He held up a hand to forestall the protest she couldn't even form. "A quiet arrangement. A contract of survival." That's all. He gestured toward the descending sun, a fiery wound bleeding across the sky. "Marry me by sunset. That is the only job I can offer you." The world tilted. The wind seemed to fall silent. She stared at him, this stranger, this grim-faced man named Silas Blackwood, as she had learned from a faded signpost a mile back. He was offering her a lifeline, but it was coiled like a hangman's noose. A marriage. A sham. A shield forged from pragmatism and desperation. She thought of another night spent shivering in a ditch, of the gnawing hunger, of the leering faces of men in the last town. She looked at his hands, calloused, capable. She looked at his eyes. They held no malice, only a deep, abiding weariness that mirrored her own. In his brutal offer, there was a strange and terrible kind of honesty. He was not offering romance or affection. He was offering survival. And in this world, survival was the only prayer she had left. Her own voice, when she finally found it, was a whisper of dust and resignation. "Yes." The days that followed were a silent education in hardship. Alara learned the brutal arithmetic of the plains, where every drop of water was a treasure and every calorie of energy was a carefully spent coin. Silas was a man of relentless routine. From sunrise to sunset, he worked, and he expected the same of her. There were no gentle instructions, no words of encouragement. He taught by action. He showed her once how to mend the barbed wire fence, his large, calloused hands deftly twisting the metal, and then handed her the pliers, his expression unreadable as he watched her fumbling, bleeding fingers learn the task. He never commented on her soft hands, now blistered and raw, nor on the weariness that settled deep into her bones each night. His silence was not cruel. It was a wall, solid and impenetrable. Their tiny cabin became a world of its own, governed by unspoken rules. They moved around each other with a careful, practiced distance, two planets held in a tense orbit. He slept on a cot by the door, leaving her the small, straw-ticked bed. She rose before him to stoke the fire, the small flame a defiant point of light against the vast, pre-dawn dark. She learned to make biscuits from flour and water, to stretch a piece of salted pork to last a week, to find a grim satisfaction in the neat rows of her mended stitches on his worn work shirts. He was an observer, she realized. He saw everything. He saw when the water bucket was nearly empty and would appear with a full one, setting it down without a word. He saw when her axe handle was splintered and, the next morning, a new one, sanded smooth, would be leaning against the woodpile. These were his only concessions to her presence, his only form of communication beyond the clipped, necessary instructions about the day's labor. Her past life, the one with soft dresses and books and laughter, felt like a dream belonging to someone else. That woman was gone, sloughed off like a snake's skin in the relentless sun. In her place was a new person, one who knew the heft of an axe, the ache of a well-pulled weed, the taste of water drawn from deep in the earth. She began to find a rhythm in the work, a strength in her own weary muscles. She was no longer just a desperate woman. She was a homesteader, part of this land, this struggle. She watched Silas as he worked, the fluid economy of his movements, the way he understood the moods of the sky and the language of his livestock. He was as much a part of this place as the weathered rock and the stubborn, sparse grass. There was a dignity in his silence, a deep and lonely resilience that she began, slowly, to understand. She was beginning to see the man behind the wall, the protector beneath the pragmatist. One evening, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind shrieked, and rain lashed against the cabin. The sound was terrifying, a reminder of nature's absolute power. She found herself standing by the small window, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling. Silas came to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. They watched the lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos outside. "It'll pass," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was not a promise of comfort, but a statement of fact. And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a long, long time. A sliver of safety. The arrival of a rider was an event, a disruption to the fragile peace they had cultivated. Alara saw him from the vegetable patch, a stout man on a fine horse, kicking up a plume of dust that signaled importance and impatience. Silas met him by the fence line, his body a rigid line of defense. Alara drew closer, her hand resting on the handle of the hoe, the wood worn smooth and familiar. She knew without being told that this was a threat. The man was Sterling Henderson, a name she'd heard Silas mutter once with a particular kind of distaste. Henderson's ranch bordered theirs, and his ambition was as vast as the territory he already controlled. His eyes, small and shrewd, dismissed Silas and landed on Alara, a smirk twisting his fleshy lips. "Well now, Blackwood," Henderson boomed, his voice slick with condescension. "Heard you'd taken on some help. Didn't realize you were so desperate you had to pick up strays from the trail." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. She doesn't look like she has the constitution for this kind of work. Alara felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The old fear of being helpless, of being judged and found wanting. But then she felt Silas shift beside her. It was a subtle movement, but it changed the very air between them. He took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet, each word chipped from ice. "This is Mrs. Blackwood." The words hung in the air, a stunning, absolute declaration. He had never called her that before. He had never referred to her as anything at all. "And you're on her land." Henderson's smirk faltered. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. He had come to intimidate a solitary man, to press his advantage in a long-simmering dispute over water rights to the creek that marked their border. The presence of a wife, a legitimate, recognized wife, changed the legal and social calculus. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "Since when? Seems mighty convenient." "Since the day she arrived," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "Our business is our own. State yours or ride on." "My business is the creek," Henderson snarled, his joviality gone. "You've been damming it more than your share. That water flows to my herds." "The water is shared," Silas countered evenly. "We take what we're entitled to. No more." "I say otherwise." Henderson's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "And I have the men to back me up." It was a naked threat. The air crackled with tension. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her fear was now mingled with a fierce, protective anger. This was her home. This man, Silas, had given her a name and a shield when she had nothing. She would not stand by like a frightened mouse while it was threatened. Without thinking, she moved to stand level with Silas. Her chin lifted, her eyes meeting Henderson's with a cold fire he had not expected. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her posture, her presence at Silas's side, was its own statement. "We are united." Henderson stared at them, at the unyielding man and the suddenly defiant woman. He saw not a desperate farmer and his stray, but a fortress, small but solid. He was a bully, accustomed to preying on the weak and isolated. This unified front disconcerted him. With a final, frustrated curse, he yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal sharply. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he spat, before galloping away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. The dust settled, and silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. The world seemed to hold its breath. Alara could feel the tremor in her own hands, the adrenaline slowly receding. Silas stood for a long moment, his back to her, watching the spot on the horizon where Henderson had disappeared. The rigid line of his shoulders slowly softened. He turned, and his eyes found hers. The wall was still there, but for the first time, she thought she saw a crack in it, a glimpse of something vulnerable and grateful within. He gave a single, slow nod. It was more eloquent than any speech. Said, "You stood with me." Said, "Thank you." Said, "We survived." And in the quiet space of that shared glance, the foundation of their strange, silent bargain shifted, settling into something new, something that felt inexplicably like home. That evening, the air inside the cabin was different. The tension of the afternoon had scoured the atmosphere, leaving behind a quiet clarity. The confrontation with Henderson had been a crucible, and from it, their arrangement had emerged transformed. It was no longer a simple contract of survival between two strangers. It was a partnership, tested and proven. As Alara prepared their meager meal, she was aware of Silas watching her. It wasn't the detached observation of before, but a gaze that held a new weight, a new awareness. He sat at the small wooden table, cleaning his rifle, the methodical click and slide of metal a rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. When she placed a plate of beans and biscuits before him, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but a jolt of warmth passed between them, startling in its intensity. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for an instant, the years of solitude and hardship in his face seemed to recede. A flicker of an emotion she couldn't name. Gratitude, respect, perhaps something more, was there, raw and unguarded. He cleared his throat, the sound gruff in the quiet room. "The dam will need reinforcing tomorrow," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, but she heard the unspoken word beneath it. "We will need to reinforce the dam." The inclusion was a quiet revolution. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of his shirt, frayed and neglected. Without a word, she retrieved her sewing kit from the small crate that held her few belongings. She sat on the stool opposite him and gestured toward his arm. He hesitated for only a second before extending it, holding perfectly still as she began to stitch the worn fabric together. Her needle moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, a small domestic act of repair that felt monumental. They sat in a companionable silence, the only sounds the whisper of thread through cloth and the soft sigh of the dying fire. In that shared stillness, a new language was being written between them, one of gestures and shared purpose, not of words. She had come to this place a beggar, pleading for a job, willing to accept any terms to escape the abyss. She had agreed to a marriage of convenience, a hollow arrangement meant to provide a name and a roof. But standing her ground against Henderson, working side by side with this silent, steady man, she had found something far more valuable. She had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience forged in the dust and the sun. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances but the architect of her own survival. This land, once a symbol of her desolation, was now hers to defend. This house, once a stranger's shelter, was now her home. As she tied off the final stitch and snipped the thread, Silas flexed his arm, looking at the neat, strong seam she had created. He met her gaze across the warm, shadowed space between them. "Thank you, Alara," he said, her name a quiet affirmation in the night. It was the first time he had used it, and in that one word, she heard the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come, each one faced not alone, but together.